Here, and if you have your Bibles, will you turn to Proverbs chapter 11? Proverbs chapter 11, and we are going to look at two verses, verse 24 and 25. I try not to complain, or if I'm sick, I try not to just cover it up and just act like I'm not and preach, but I'm just going to go ahead and warn you, if I make funny faces, I've had this sneeze stuck right up in between my eyeballs for like 2 days, and occasionally it just starts tingling, and I have to stop and think, well, am I going to sneeze? So if I stop speaking and I just stand here with a weird look on my face, I want to explain that. So I just had that sensation. I thought I was going to, but never mind. I don't want you to know how sick I am. I'm not really that sick. I'm just sinusy, but I want to explain my awkwardness if I have a weird look on my face. It's not just my normal confusion. Proverbs 11, 24, 25. Today is our last installment of our Money Myth series. And we've spent, this will be our fourth week, and we've covered a lot of things. And we've looked, and we kind of laid the foundation in understanding that first, all of our wealth and all of our possessions, everything belongs to God. And we established His ownership. Then we looked at the biblical ways to make money and ways that the Bible says we shouldn't acquire wealth. And then we looked last week at what to do with our money. And today I want to expand on that, and I want to talk just basically about giving and what the Bible says about giving. You say, oh, Pastor, goodness gracious. Well, I just want to say this. If you tune out just on giving just because it sounds like, well, I know we're supposed to give, or you feel guilty or something like that, or you just feel like I'm asking for money, you're going to miss a blessing. Because I'm going to tell you, Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. And folks, I believe that. I don't believe that's just church rhetoric to get people to let go of money. I don't believe that at all. I believe it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. And I believe if you want to have a blessed life, you'll be a giver. I believe that. I really do. And so I believe if you want to be blessed, and I believe if you want to be a godly, blessed Christian, I believe that you will listen to what the Bible has to say about giving. And so money myth number 4 is that always look out for number 1. And we know that's wrong. Well, actually, it's not wrong, is it? It's actually right, because who's number 1? God's number 1. So well, actually, I guess it is true. Look out for number 1, but make sure you've got the right number 1. But Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24 and 25, I want you to hear the wisdom of Solomon. More importantly, I want you to hear the truth of God. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. Now, I want to say something about giving. This verse says if you give, you're going to get. If you don't give, you're going to dwindle. If you water, you will be watered. And I want to say this right off the top. God's plan for giving is not that you give $10 today and then it comes back to you next week, or that you give $10 today and you get $100 next week. God's plan for giving, and I believe that we've established this, God doesn't just repay us in physical blessings, okay? Because if it was like that, it would just be like a Ponzi scheme, wouldn't it? Well, I'll give God $100 today and then I'll get it back in a couple weeks. That would just be, that's not what He's talking about. He's talking about a lifestyle of giving that is characterized by the blessing of God, okay? And it's not saying that everyone who gives becomes a millionaire. It's not saying that, but it's just saying there's a general principle of blessedness and of receiving that comes when you live a life of giving. And I believe that is, we're able to demonstrate that from the Scriptures. And so understand that. The prosperity preachers who say, well, if you will sow a faith seed into our ministry, God is going to erase your debt, you need to just discard that. There's no biblical basis for that. And I've heard people say that, well, if you sow a $100 seed, God's going to do this. Folks, that is speaking where God has not spoken. You take what God has said and you live by that. And I heard one, possibly maybe a little more cantankerous pastor. We as pastors, sometimes we can say things that are a little offensive and a little brash. I know that because, well, the Scriptures are that way sometimes. But I had a pastor friend of mine, and I'll just tell you this, and Ronnie, you know who I'm talking about. He said one of his members came up to him one time, and he said, and they come to the church, and they came to his church and were there all the time. And they said, well, Pastor, I just want you to know that, we give our tithes to so-and-so, and it was somebody that had a big ministry, and they were on television, but they came to a local church, and, enjoyed the benefits of coming to church, but they were telling the pastor, but we give our tithes to this other ministry. And that's fine to give to other ministries above and beyond your tithe. That's totally fine. They said, we tithe to that. Now, what they were really doing, they didn't tithe at all. And they were trying to make up for the fact that they never put anything in the offering plate, trying to explain that. But they said to the pastor, they said, we tithe to so-and-so's ministry. He said, well, I'll tell you what, when you get sick and go to the hospital, you call so-and-so and have him come see you. But folks, let me tell you, if you enjoy the blessing of a local church, and if you enjoy what is provided by a local church, folks, it is God's plan, and you need to sow into that local church. I believe that with all my heart. I certainly do. But anyway, that's kind of a brash statement, but sometimes truth is best communicated in a very brash, upfront way. He said, next time you get sick, you call him. But anyway, I'm not going to say that to you, but he said that. But we established this last week. Giving to the Lord's work is the first priority in your budget. We established that before you do anything else. And folks, I believe this. I believe that we do what we plan to do. You know, if I say, well, I'm going to witness, I'm going to do better at witnessing in 2014, and that's all you ever say, you're not going to do any better at witnessing. But if you say, on such and such date, I'm going to talk to so-and-so about his soul, then it'll happen. Usually what we put on our calendar and what we make plans to do happens, and the things that we just kind of say, I'm going to get fit eventually, I'm going to read my Bible eventually. When it's one of those eventually someday things, someday really means no day. And so I believe in putting things down and planning and putting things on paper. And I believe if you want to get control of your money, the best way to do that is to put your spending on paper at the first of the month before you ever write out a bill. Put all your spending on paper and know where it's going to go. I believe that is a responsible way to do that, and then hold yourself accountable to that. That'll keep you accountable. That being said, I believe that giving to the Lord ought to be the first thing that is planned out of your budget. Because here's what's going to happen. You say, well, I'm going to get down to the last of the month, see how much extra money I've got, and then I'm going to give the Lord out of that. I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're not going to give to the Lord because there's always something else. As Proverbs says in another place, the leech has two daughters, give. Basically saying that life is like that. It just continually has a drain on what we have. And so if you don't have a budget to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to put so much in retirement, I'm going to put so much in savings, but I'm going to give this to the Lord, I'm going to give this amount, then you're not going to have that to give. And you need to do that. So it ought to be the first priority in your budget, in your plan. So number one, I want you to notice this, is that greed is the enemy of the giver. If you want to give, you need to get rid of covetousness and greed because that will harm you. Covetousness and greed will curb your desire to give. If your desire to receive things is greater than your desire to give things, then guess what's going to win out? Now, in the passage that I have read to you, it says, another withholds that he should give, that which he should give, and only suffers want. So if you're not giving what you ought to give, let me tell you, greed is the enemy of the giver. Charles Spurgeon says this, many a man's soul has been ruined by his great love of money, although he had but little money to love. I like that, don't you? He says, many men have been ruined by love of money, even though he only had a little bit of money to love. Now, we get this false sense that people with a lot of money are somehow evil because they've got all this money, and if you're real poor, then you're blessed. There's scriptures that people have kind of taken out of context to say that, but the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. I've known some dirt poor folks that love money. And if you want to see them, you go down to the gas station and watch who's playing the lottery. You're going to see a bunch of people that don't have a dime to their name, but they love money. You understand what I'm saying here? But I've known some people who are very wealthy that had acquired wealth through hard work, through industry, and gave and sacrificed and were able to do great things that love the Lord. Okay, so understand this is that's not an indicator. What is the indicator is the greed, is the love of the money, and there are many people who love money who don't even have a lot of money to love. But anyway, greed will not pay in the end. Proverbs 15:27 says this, he who is greedy for gain troubles his own house. I believe this. I believe if you have an attitude of greed and if you have an attitude of covetousness, I believe what will happen is you will see a steady dwindling on your finances. I believe if you are trying to grasp and you're trying to pile up and you're trying to hoard, there's a biblical principle that if you hoard up gold, it begins to rust. If you hoard up clothing, the moths eat it. And James speaks about that. He says, you have heaped up riches to your hurt. And I believe this, that if you heap up riches and you try to be greedy, I believe that what's going to happen is you're going to have less and less, okay? But when you are generous, when you have an open hand and money's coming and going, you're going to be able to accumulate wealth. So he who is greedy for gain troubles his own house. I believe that most certainly. There was a man in a certain neighborhood who had been a very greedy man. He had owned a lot of property, and he had actually mistreated a lot of people in his business. And there was a woman who was a godly woman, and she somewhat, prophetically said this. She said, "You mark my words, the day will come that individual won't have a penny to his name." And sure enough, that man who had been very shrewd, and he had actually cheated and beat a lot of people, he actually wound up, when he died, he was living in a shack out town, and he had lost everything that he owned. I'm not saying that happens to every greedy person, but I'm saying this, that it's a general principle that greed will leave you lacking. Greed will leave you lacking, okay? Now, I want to say this too. Greed is earthly and satanic. Colossians 3:5 says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." Do you know that the big one on God's top 10 list, the 10 Commandments, the first one is don't have any other gods before me, idolatry. And it ends with covetousness. And here we have that covetousness actually is idolatry. So understand this, that if you are greedy, if you are covetous, if you're just longing for more and more and more, I mean, we all see the shiny stuff and want it at times, but if you have an uncontrollable, if you have an unchecked desire to acquire, then you are committing idolatry. You don't have to put a Baal in your house. You don't have to put a Buddha in your house. You don't have to put some shrine to a god in your house. If you have unchecked and you have this covetousness that is not subjected to the Holy Spirit and quenched, you have an idol in your life. And Jesus gave a parable that highlights this. Jesus in Luke 12, he said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses." And then he tells a parable. He tells a parable about a man who was a farmer. And he said this farmer, one year, had just a bumper crop. It was just a huge crop he had. And he said, "What am I going to do with all of this that I have?" He says, "I'm going to tear down the barns." He says, "I don't even have enough room to store what I've got. I'm going to tear down the barns that I have and build bigger barns to store my goods." And he says, that night, though, the Lord said to him, he says, "You are a fool, you fool." He said, "This night your soul will be required of thee." Now, who's this stuff going to belong to? Now, I want to say this. It's not irresponsible to want to save or take care of what God's given you. But just notice the subtleties of this parable. The man had no view of the future as far as eternity was concerned. He had a view of earthly future, of his future in this world, but he had no concern for his eternal future. This man died lost. He died without Christ, although he had full barns and he had a surplus. The Bible doesn't say he was a greedy man, that he wasn't going to give to anybody, but it doesn't say that he was either. And so what's happening here, Jesus gives us in the context of covetousness. The man is concerned about heaping it up, and he even says, "I'm going to say to my soul, you have much stuff laid up for many days." So the idea here is that he's going to retire early or something. I'm going to take all this wealth, lay it up for myself, so that in the coming days I don't have to work real hard. I've got this, And Jesus says, hey, his soul was required of him that night. And Jesus says that's not a proper attitude toward money. Hoarding it for your own benefit is not good. He says you need to be able to let go of that. And if God blesses you with a surplus, I believe it's scriptural. If God blesses you with a surplus, yes, there is some that you should save. As we said last week, go to the ant. But there's also, if God blesses you with a surplus, you need to be giving that, and you need to be giving some of that to help those who have need. Okay? I think we've all seen times when we've had need, and it would be good for those who have surplus to be able to give to those who have need. But he says this, he said, "Take heed, beware of covetousness." Now I want you to hear what Jesus says. "For one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses." Now I want you to hear what Jesus says. He says, your life is not made up of all the stuff you've got piled up. Your life consists of, having something to eat. I mean, if you don't eat, you'll die, You need clothes to wear. You need shelter. These are needs. These are things your life consists of. You need love. You need God. You need faith. These are things that your life consists of. But your life does not consist of all of this stuff we've got packed away in storage. So I want you to think about our substance like this. Jesus is saying, here's a big old circle with all of the stuff you have. Okay? And he draws a little bitty circle in the middle of it. He says, this is the stuff that you actually need to live. This is the stuff that's essential for your life. He says, and all this other stuff in the circle is superfluous. If it burns up, you're still going to live. You're still going to get by in your life. And so Jesus says, don't go around trying to pile stuff up. He says, because it doesn't take that much stuff to live a fulfilled, blessed life. And we think the more that we pile up, the more that we're going to have, the more fulfillment we're going to have. That's absolutely false. Matter of fact, just Katrina and I, just the stuff we have, I think I would be a lot more at peace if we had less junk. It's just, you don't even know where to put the stuff, and you just pile stuff up. And Jesus says, it's just a very small thing. Live lean and live on what you actually need and have some nice things, but don't say that I've got to have this huge, huge amount of stuff piled up. He says, because that does not enrich your life. There is a small realm of things that will enrich your life. Good food, having clothes to wear, things like that. But he says all this other stuff. He says the toys and the gadgets and the things, he says that doesn't really enrich your life. And he says, and you need to be aware of that. So if wealth doesn't really enrich us, then we need to do what will be responsible with wealth. We need to live in a way that is enriching and live in a way that enriches others. So moving on, I just wanted to say that about greed. Secondly, where we'll spend most of our time, generosity is the practice of the giver. Generosity is the practice of the giver. Here's a quote by Winston Churchill. He said this, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. I like that. We make a living by what we get, we make a life by what we give. And I believe that wholeheartedly. You take the people who have been most remembered after their death are the people who most gave in their lifetime. Okay, you understand that? The people who were most remembered, appreciated, loved, and left a legacy behind were those who gave to others and gave their lives to help others. You see, we celebrate war heroes who give their lives for us. We celebrate them because they made a life with what they gave. We celebrate, missionaries who go and, we celebrate Lottie Moon and she died on the mission field trying to take the gospel to Chinese children. And we even have an offering every year at Southern Baptist, the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. She made a life, she made a legacy by giving. Okay? How many people do you think of that were very, very, very selfish that we go around and celebrate their life, and go, oh, boy, wasn't that great? We don't do that. You make a living by what you get. You make a life by what you give. And I believe that wholeheartedly. All right? Now, let me give you just a few quick principles, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but just to kind of outline a biblical theology of giving. Number one, giving is the ultimate purpose of making money. Now, some of you might disagree with that, but read it from the Scriptures. Ephesians 4:28, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. He says you need to get out here and work hard, work with your hands, do labor, and build wealth, take care of your needs, and then have a surplus that from that surplus you can help other people. Folks, that's the purpose of working and having a surplus beyond what you need and what your family needs is to be able to help other people. So the purpose ultimately of working and making money is to give. Secondly, your giving should be regular and planned. We're going to talk about this more just in a moment. But it's a biblical principle. Don't leave your giving to just, well, I'm here on Sunday morning, what have I got in my wallet? Here's a 10, throw it in. No, that's no good. You don't need to live your whole life that way. You don't live any other part of your life that way. Don't live that part of your life that way. Giving should be regular and planned. Paul tells the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians 16, they were going to take up an offering for relief to help other people that were in need. He says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the church of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, Sunday, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. Paul says, intentionally budget out some money and lay it aside on the first day of the week. When I get there, you've got it set aside. And so it was planned. The giving was planned and it was regular. It was weekly. Every week they would say, okay, I've got this much. I'm going to give it. So your giving ought to be a regular thing and it ought to be a planned thing. Giving should be proportional to income. In Mark 12, there's a episode in the temple. And many of the religious people would come and they were very wealthy and they would cast in money from their wealth. Now let me just say this. If you have wealth to give, then give proportionately. That's good. But then there comes this little widow woman who has nothing. And she casts in 2 mites. Those are 2 very small coins, the smallest pieces of money in their economy, which would be it would be worth about 1/5 of the cent in our money, about 1/5 of the penny. And she had 2 of those. So basically she had almost half of a penny. And she threw it in the offering. And Jesus looks at that woman and he says, she has put in more than all the rest of them. And you say, oh, preacher, well, she gave from her heart. No, don't talk like that. That's silly. Yeah, you give with your heart. That's a given. But that's not why she gave more. Jesus says why she gave more, because that was all the money she actually had. Of course she gave with her heart. If you give everything you got, I don't think you can give everything you got and not give with your heart. Jesus says she gave more than all of them. He says because those Pharisees and those religious people, they gave a lot of money, but they still had a lot of money in their pockets when they left. This poor woman, in an act of faith, came and cast in everything that she had, which wasn't very much. But proportional, she gave 100% where they might have gave 30 or 40%. And so on a proportional basis, she gave more. Giving should be proportional. I'm not telling you to cast everything you've got into the offering. I don't know what the circumstances was. This woman had a very little bit of money. She might have even said in her heart, I love the Lord, but this right here won't buy me much food, and I'm starving. I'm going to cast my care on the Lord. I'm just going to give what little I've got to Him and trust Him. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to give in a way that's going to, take away from your family. I'm not going to tell you to give an offering like that. But I am going to tell you this: if God tells you to, you better do it. Did you understand what I said there? If God leads you, and I'm not telling you to go out here and seek some mystical experience, but there have been times that I have felt like I should give in a certain way, and I just felt, without budgeting it, without looking, I just felt led to give something. And sometimes it was in a way that would even seem to affect my bottom line. You ever been there? When God leads you to do that, and you pray about it, and you know it's God, you just give it. And I don't care if it's every penny you've got, if it's from God. Now, if it's your boneheaded decision, then you might be messing up. But if it's from God, you give it, and you give it in faith, and you give it without grudging it. I'll tell you what will happen. You'll be blessed. You'll be blessed for doing that. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you to give an abnormal amount, but if God leads you, you give what God tells you to give. And I'll tell you what else to do. Above and beyond your tithe, above and beyond what you ought to give, let's say we have a missionary come in here, or let's say, like we've had Dennis come in before, he's raised support for some of the kids. Let's say we have somebody come in and they're raising support for some mission. Or maybe we take out the Lottie Moon offering and the Annie Armstrong offering. It goes to missionaries. I'll tell you what you need to do in advance of that. You ought to be praying and say, Lord, give me a figure that you want me to give. Maybe look at your budget and say, well, I can afford to give this much, but be praying. And God may say, I want you to give. He may say, I want you to give $100. And that may seem like a lot. But if you feel like you ought to give it, you ought to give it. And I'll tell you this, if you will involve God and involve prayer in your giving process, your giving will be blessed. It'll transform your life. I guarantee you it will. But anyway, God sees more than the portion that is given. He sees the proportion. You see, men see what is given. If you give a big donation, I look at what you've given, and I say, oh, that's big. Okay? But God doesn't see what is given. He sees what is left. Okay? You understand that? He doesn't see what is given. He sees what's left over after you've given it. All right? And that's how He measures our hearts. Giving should be sacrificial. Let me tell you something. There's a lot of talk about worship and all this, and that's a dynamic topic to talk about. But I'm going to say this. I don't care what kind of worship it is. The heart of worship is sacrifice. If your worship doesn't cost you anything, your worship is worthless. If you come in here on Sunday morning and it's not cost you anything to worship God, if you have not in some way sacrificed of your time or your energy or something of that nature, or even your money, if you've not sacrificed to the Lord, you are not worshiping. I don't care if you have the best tenor voice to sing these hymns. You're not worshiping until you've sacrificed. When they came to a worship service in the Old Testament, do you know what it meant? It meant losing some off their bottom line. They would take one of the best lambs they had, or they'd take one of the best bulls they had, and they would lose it. It would be sacrificed and given, and that's how they worshiped. The worship house of the Old Testament looked more like a butcher shop, okay? Because they came and they gave sacrifices. And the priests ate some of those sacrifices. That's how the priests lived. It was given to the Lord, but the priests also enjoyed it. But it was given to the Lord. And I'll say this, if you don't sacrifice, if you're not giving in a way that sacrifices, if you're not giving of your time and your energy, if you're coming to this church and you're giving the bare minimum, you're just clocking in on Sunday and going home, let me tell you something, you're not worshiping when you get here, you're not worshiping the rest of the week, you're not worshiping, you don't know what worship is. Why am I making such a big deal about that? I believe worship is the missing jewel of the church of today. I believe we know how to read our Bibles, I believe we know how to teach, we know how to do a lot of things, we know how to have programs and all of that. But we have forgotten how to worship, and we have forgotten how to give God the best and the first in our lives and in our hearts. I believe we've forgotten that. I believe the Church of America has forgotten that for the most part. I believe generally across the board, denominationally across the nation, I believe us as materialistic, bottom line, time conscious, okay? We come in and say, preacher, get us out by 12. Hey, I don't have to preach for 45 minutes. That'd be nice if we just get up here and sing worship for about 45 minutes and have church. You know, hey, what I'm saying is, when you're so time conscious that you can't focus on the service, you're not worshiping. When you're so money conscious that you can't give without begrudging it, you're not worshiping. When you're so strapped by other activities outside of church that you cannot donate your time and your energy and your thoughts to your devotional life and to the church life, you're not worshiping. It's just a bottom line. Preacher, what's your text for that? Well, it's all through the Scripture. Giving is sacrificial, but let me give you the best one. There was a situation in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 24. There was a situation in which David was going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. It was necessary. There had been a sin in the nation, and David was going to make an atonement for the nation by offering a sacrifice. Let me tell you what happened. Now, you listen to this. You need to hear this. And David was away from his home, okay? All David had on him was what he carried with him. And David was going to make a personal sacrifice to the Lord. And this old buddy that knew David, his name was Araunah. And Araunah said, I'll tell you what, David, over here I got all these cows. And he said, I got my whole land is over here, David. He said, you just go over here and take whatever you need. You build you an altar. Take whatever of my cattle and sheep you want, and you offer a sacrifice. Well, that's pretty good, isn't it? Nope, that won't work. You know what David said? He looked at Araunah right in the eye and he said, I'll tell you something. He said, I'm not going to offer God something that didn't cost me anything. That's deep. That's worship. And I'll tell you, David messed up. David messed up a lot of things, but he wrote the majority of the best worship manual that's ever been written, the Psalms. And David knew how to worship, and he knew that worship, at the heart of it, was cost and sacrifice. And he says, unless it affects my bottom line, I'm not going to give it. He said, because if I go over here and sacrifice your cow, I didn't offer it, you did. He says, so I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to buy those cows from you, and then I'm going to kill them to the Lord. That is somebody who understands what worship is and who understands the worth and what God deserves. He said, because he deserves more than something that was for free. Now, let me say this too, and Lordy, I'll get on all kinds of hobby horses if I'm not careful. You know, if you've got something in your home, maybe you've got some old clothes that don't fit you anymore. Maybe you give them to somebody. I don't laugh. It happens to all of us. I've got some that don't fit me anymore. And you give them to somebody. Don't you go away feeling like you've done some charitable thing, because you don't need them. That didn't cost you anything. Now, when you go and buy somebody a new set of clothes, then you've given. Does that make sense? If your kids have got toys and they can't play with them and you don't need them to the nursery, if they're clean, we'll take them, we'll clean them up and use them. That's good. But you didn't give anything. You didn't give a thing. Now, if you went out and bought some brand new toys and gave it, then you gave something. Does that make sense, folks? Because if it doesn't cost you anything, you didn't give. It's just the bottom line. If it doesn't cost you anything, you're not giving. All right? And so that's what we need to do. We need to give in a way that costs us. We need to give in a way that is significant. Don't give the Lord something that there's no value in. Don't give the Lord something that there's no personal value in. Now, if I come up to you and you need a Bible, and I've got 12 Bibles sitting there gathering dust, and I'm not using them, and I give you one, I still not give you anything. It's a precious gift, and you are very much benefited by it, and I actually have given you a great gift because it's the Bible. But as far as the cost factor, it's not cost me any, because I've got all these Bibles I'm not using. Now, if I come up and I give you my brand new Bible that I'm using, that I need, and I say, well, here, you need a Bible, take it, and I have to go out and buy one to replace it, then I've given. But until there's cost involved, you've not given. And don't go around and all these things and say, well, I've given this great big offering, or feel in yourself like you have, because if it doesn't cost, it's not a gift and it's not worship. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just trying to define what God sees as worship and giving. All right? Giving should be secret. Jesus said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand does. He says, don't do your charitable deeds before men. This is Matthew 6, 1-4. You can read it for yourself. He says, because if you do that, you won't have any reward from your Father in heaven. This is kind of a cheap analogy, but let me just use it. When I was a kid, we used to go to maybe the arcade or something there at Lake Winnepesaukah and play skee ball. Whoever's ever played skee ball, and you throw a little ball up and it goes in and you get tickets, right? You can take those tickets, you can cash out for whatever you want. If you've got enough, you can get a big old stuffed bear, or if you just got a little bit, you can go get whatever you want. But you cash out. You take what you have earned and you cash out. Let me tell you something. When you give, you can choose to cash out. Did you know that? If you give a gift and you give it to the church, but you go out here and crow like a big rooster, then you've just cashed out. God doesn't owe you a thing because you got exactly what you wanted. You got attention. And I see some things, and there are some things here at Reed Spring. Maybe somebody's passed away, and we'll put their name on it, and I think that's good and honorable. I think that's fine. But I'll tell you what gets my goat. When somebody gives, they say, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give a big old thing to help you build that new building, David, but I want you to put a plaque that said that's the Umphrey Memorial Fellowship Hall. Oh, it just burns my biscuits. When I go to church and see that, I just want to leave because that's idolatrous. I'm just going to say it out loud, okay? If you give in such a way and then you ask that your name be placed on it in a way that it is prominent, you're not going to get diddly when you get to heaven for that because you've already cashed in. You've got the attention you wanted. And I see that a lot in Christian circles. I know that's very offensive to people that give a lot of times because that happens a lot. Up at Clear Creek, we've got all these buildings. All these buildings are named, and they got people's last names on them because they've been big donors that give them, and I think it's great. I'm glad they gave. I'm glad those things are there. But I think that's not the heart of giving. You don't give that way. You give in secret. And there's no way to mince and dice Jesus' words here. Let your giving be in secret. Don't let anybody see it. Now, if you by circumstance come and find out something I did, I can't help that. But if I'm publicizing it, if I'm making it known, if I uncover it, well, you know I did that, you know. Somebody said, well, Buddy was in a need the other day. Somebody bought him a new set of tires. And I said, well, you know, I did that. I went over and bought him a new set of tires. He was strapped. Then you know what? I've just cashed out. But if you keep it secret, you keep it between you and God, I'll tell you what you'll do. God will reward you when you get to heaven. That's how that works, folks. Let your giving be in secret. And giving should be willful and sincere. I believe that. And I said it before. If you I'm going to talk about tithing here just a minute. And I believe that 10% off the gross, not the net, belongs to God. You know, oh, preacher, you just want money. Well, hey, I've done that. I've done it when we've not had it, and I've done it when we have had it. So don't talk to me about greed. Okay. I believe 10% right off the gross is God's. I believe that with all my heart. But if you have to begrudge that, and you have to give that with some kind of bitterness in your heart toward the Lord, toward the church, then just keep it. Now, you're not going to be blessed either way. But if you can't give it and give it sincerely and give it willingly, God doesn't want it, and frankly, I don't want it either. You know, speaking for God as a representative of this church, don't put it in here. I'm afraid you're going to give a curse and not a blessing. You give when you see that it's God's will for you to give, and you give it cheerfully. 2 Corinthians 9 says, let each one gives as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity. Don't do it because somebody makes you do it or guilt you to do it. He says, for God loves a cheerful giver. And the word cheerful is the Greek word hilaros, which is where we get our word hilarious. So God loves somebody that comes up to the offering plate and just laughs just laughing. No, that's not what it means literally, but the connection's there. You should have overabundant joy in giving. And if you don't, you're not giving. Now, there are 3 ways you can give, and I'm going to cover these quickly. Number 1 is the tithe. The tithe is 10% of our income. You say, Pastor, where do you get that? Well, it's actually pretty basic because the word tithe is literally just an old English word that means tenth. You see the similarity, right? Tithe, tenth. It's literally, the word tithe, literally in its purest form, just means the tenth. So if you come and say, I'm giving my tithes, but you're just giving 1 or 2%, well, I've come to give my tenth, well, you're not tithing. Just say, well, I'm giving what I've got. If that's what you've got, you just give it. But the tithe literally is the tenth, and that's what it means in its meaning. So only when you're giving a tenth are you giving a tithe. Now, the Lord commanded this for Israel. The Scripture's there. The tithe is the Lord's. The tenth is the Lord's. That's 10%. Now, you might say, well, Pastor, that's an Old Testament requirement. God required that of the Jews. Now, we're under grace. We're not under law. You know, that's exactly right. I'd love to talk to you about that. God help us if we would let a self-righteous Jew under the law do better than we would do under the bloody cross of Calvary. Here Jesus stands bleeding and dying, and his last drop of blood drips from his body, and we say, yeah, I'm under grace. I don't have to give a whole lot. Oh, you hypocrite. I ought to chase you out of here with whip. You don't understand the cross of Calvary. You don't understand how the kingdom works. I'm not going to let some old self-righteous Pharisee outdo me in loving the Lord, and I don't think you should either. And for that matter, Abraham gave a tenth of his possessions in the book of Genesis before the law was ever given. Jacob also made a vow to the Lord. He said, I'm going to give you the tenth of all that I have. That was before the law was ever given. That's before God ever said this. And so the principle of the tithe predates the law. And folks, I believe it goes on beyond the law. Now, I would challenge you not to just do it because I said it. I would challenge you to get on your face before God and say, Lord, now I want to know, between you and me, what do you want? I'm not telling you to just blindly obey me. I'm telling you to open the Scriptures. I'm telling you to get on your knees and pray. I'm telling you not to be selfish, but to be purely honest with you and God and say, God, what do you want me to give? And you give it. And I believe you'll come up with this. Tithing never was mentioned in my church growing up. I don't think I ever heard tithing mentioned at all. And the idea was that if we preach on money, we're carnal. But folks, Jesus said money's spiritual. It has to do with how we have a relationship with God. And Jesus even said, if you're not faithful with money, you won't be faithful with anything else, spiritually speaking. I don't think I ever heard a sermon on tithing. I don't think I ever heard anybody talk about tithing. And I even started preaching. I was 15, and I started getting little jobs. I never tithed. I would give, like 10 or 20 or something. I just, whatever I had. And out of high school, I got a pretty good job. I was making pretty good money for a guy that had no bills and lived at home with mom and dad. I was doing pretty good. And I was a frugal guy. I threw it in the bank. And I started hearing people talk about tithing. And I thought, well, that's just that old law Pharisee stuff. And then it got to bother me. And I thought, well, I'm going to give a little bit more. And they just still wouldn't leave me alone. And I'm going to tell you something else, just personally, I believe there's a scriptural case for it, but I'm going to tell you what I did. I said, Lord, I don't even know if this is right. I've never even heard this preached on. I was very young. I said, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Lord. I'm going to give you 10%. I'm going to figure it up every week off of what I make. That way I don't have to leave Sunday wondering if I gave what I owe you. And you know what? I've never worried about it since. Never worried about it since. Don't worry about money. You see, when you hold on to it and you're greedy with it, you worry about money. Oh, did I give? Hey, when you let it go, you don't worry about it. You don't worry about it. Now, let me say something else, and then we'll put the tithe away. But let me say this. Jesus, by the way, upheld tithing. The Pharisees were very meticulous in their tithing. He said, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's in Matthew 23. You can find it for yourself. 23, verse 23. They were very meticulous in their tithing. They were very meticulous in all these things they did, but they were very corrupt in their hearts. So yes, it is possible. You can come here and give your 10% and be a total hypocrite about it. You can. You can give your 10% and be a Christian too, and that's what you ought to do. And you know what Jesus said? He said, you Pharisees are hypocrites because you'll tithe, and you'll tithe to the most meticulous half of a cent. He said, but you won't do the things that God has commanded, and Jesus says they're more important, mercy and justice and those things. He said, but you ought to do those things and not leave the other, talking about tithing, and not leave that undone. And so, Jesus says, there's things that are more important than the percentage you give. There's a lot of things more important than that. He said, but it is important. And Malachi says this. Chapter 3, is it up here? No, I didn't put it up here. Malachi chapter 3, Malachi says that if you do not give 10% to the Lord, he says that you're robbing God. And like I said, I'm not here to guilt you or to put you in some financial bind. I'm here to make you think, go home and pray, and between you and God, you decide what God wants you to give. And maybe you say, well, Pastor, I've got so much debt, there's absolutely no way. Well, I'll tell you what you do. And you might think this sounds like a compromise, but you start out and you figure out what you can give. If it's 2, if it's 5, whatever, and you give it, and you say, Lord, if you will bless me to get free financially, I will give that 10. Now, if you feel led to just go ahead and give the 10 and leave the results to God, that's commendable. But you figure what you can. Say, Lord, I can't give what I ought to give, and I know it's not what I ought to give, but I'm going to give you 2 because I can afford that right now. Or I'm going to give you 5, I can afford that. And as soon as I get able, if you will bless me, I'll give you the 10. I believe God would honor that. I believe that He would. But anyway, here's what Malachi says. He says, will a man rob God? And God says, you have robbed me. He says, but the Jews would say, in what way have we robbed you? And he says, in tithes and offerings. He says, you are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me. Even this whole nation, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, the 10th, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field. He says, you've robbed me. He said, because you've got what belongs to me and you won't give it to me. He said, but if you would give it, he says, I will bless you. I will bless you greatly. And that's what God says in Malachi. Now let me say one last thing on this 10th. You say, well, preacher, you've made it plain. The 10% belongs to God. Nope, nope, nope. 100% belongs to God. The 10% is a representative of the 100. God does this in many, many ways. Sometimes in the way He redeemed things, in the way that He blessed people. He would bless the firstborn, represent the whole house. The 10% represents the 100. And when you give 10%, you're not saying, Lord, here's your 10% and no more. What you're doing when you give 10%, you're saying, God, you own 100%, and this is a representative offering of that fact. But Lord, I need to use some of it, and you give it to me to use. God owns 100. Now, secondly, there's offerings. Now, folks, this is absolutely voluntary, above and beyond the tithe. Now, I believe that you ought to give the tithe in your budget. And if you're so strapped, you say, I don't have any extra room, then you give your tithe and you pray and you seek God. And when you get to the place where you can give offerings, you can. But you get a preacher or somebody that tries to guilt you into giving an offering above and beyond the tithe, and you don't have it, then I don't think that's right. It comes out of the surplus. Now, if God leads you, you give whatever God leads you. But above and beyond your 10%, this is a voluntary offering that you, between you and the Lord, decide to give, and you give it. Maybe it goes to missionaries. Maybe it goes to something we're taking up an offering for. Maybe it goes to some fundraiser we're doing. But it's an offering to the Lord above and beyond the tithe. And parents, this is not something you give to your children. By the way, if you're giving to your children, you're not giving because it's staying in the family, and you're going to get that back in some way, favors or what have you. Don't think if you give your children money, you're giving to the Lord, because it doesn't work like that. You've got to give it where it doesn't come back to those who can't repay you anonymously. But anyway, Exodus 25, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they may bring me an offering. From everyone who gives it willingly with his heart, you shall take my offering. The tithe was commanded, but additional offerings are voluntary. Sometimes we ask for those. If you've got surplus, you can give those. The tithe is what God has commanded. And then thirdly and finally, I would say this, and I would say this is separate, I would say gifts. Okay, this would be what you do to help others. Okay, if you see somebody, it doesn't come through the church, it doesn't come through any missionary, but just you've got a friend that you love and they're having a hard time, and you say, hey, don't pay this back, you just take this, that's a gift. Okay, and that shouldn't come out of your tithe. That's a gift between you and them, and the Lord sees that. He says, he who gives to the poor lends to the Lord, and the Lord will repay him for his good deed. That's Proverbs 19:17. Romans 12:13 says, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. All right? James chapter 2, he says, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to him, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? In 1 John 3:17 says, whosoever has this world's good and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? So those are gifts. Tithes, offerings, gifts, they're different, and you need to learn the distinction and give accordingly. And thirdly, I want to give you this. God promises to bless the giver. And folks, let me tell you, I believe this with all my heart. I believe this. Proverbs 3:9 and 10. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. And here's one of my favorite verses on giving. Luke 6:38. Jesus says, give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. You ever go to a restaurant and you order, your entree and 2 or 3 sides? It happens a lot if you order it to go because they know you're going to get home before you see it. And you get home and they give you this little bitty old portion, right? You say, I paid for it, but they did not give me my portion. They give you just a little piddly bit of food there. You ever that happened? Hey, what happens when you open a big old bag of tater chips? You get 60% air, right? That's not good measure. But you know what God says? God says if you give and He repays you, He's going to give you in good measure. He says you take the basket and you put the grain in it and you shake it down and press it down as far as it'll go. And then you pour some more in and you shake it all the way down. Then you pour some on top and just let it fall off the top. You see, when God gives, He gives generously. He don't give little piddly things. God gives generously. He says, I'm going to give you good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. It'll be given back to you when you give. I believe that, and I live by that. And folks, if need be, I'll go broke living by that. But I don't believe I'll go broke. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But I'd rather go broke living that way and trusting God than to have a handful and not trust Him. God told the people in the book of Haggai that the reason that they had financial trouble was because they refused to give the Lord. In the book of Haggai, they had come back from captivity and they were going to rebuild the temple. But that was going to cost a lot of money to rebuild that temple. And they were making money and they weren't giving to the temple. And God says, look, He says, y'all are living in nice houses. You've come back, you've built yourself nice homes. And He says, my temple over here is laying in a shambles. And He says, and this is Haggai, you can read it for yourself, Haggai chapter 1. He says, you have so much and bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes. God says the reason that you've had financial troubles, the reason that you can't save money, I'm not saying that's particularly your reason right now, but to these people, He said the reasons you can't save money, the reason that money just falls out of your pocket and you just can't hold on to it, He says because you're simply not doing what you ought to be doing with it. And that's what He says there. Now let me say this, and I'm closing. I'm just going to throw the closing slide up here so you know for sure that I am. As a pastor, I'll tell you what. Yeah, you've made a good case, but I just believe a lot of that's from the Old Testament, and I think a lot of that's just stretching. Well, it's not. It's very plain. I think I've demonstrated that. But let me say this: if you're a practical kind of guy, if you're a bottom line kind of guy, let me spell it out for you. I don't remember how many there was the last time I heard, but I think it was like 100 or 500 missionaries waiting to go to other countries. Now, everybody would say it's good for missionaries to go, right? Because if they don't go, people are going to hell. It's good for missionaries to go because they help people, tell them about Jesus. We all say it's good for missionaries to go. Well, in our cooperative program, we have about, I forget how many, I don't even want to give a number because I'm afraid I'm wrong. But we have a lot of trained, ready-to-go missionaries that are waiting to go represent Southern Baptists around the world, but they're just simply waiting on the funding. All right? Just from a pragmatic point of view, there's much to be done for the Lord Jesus Christ. And quite frankly, there's a lot that I would like to see done here at Reed Springs Baptist Church. But you know what? It takes money. You know what I'd love to see? I'd love to see other staff added on at this church. You might say, Pastor, what are you talking about? Well, folks, I'm going to tell you, I've got more than I can handle. I'd love to have a secretary. Wouldn't it be good if we had a secretary devoted full-time just to take care of our church calendar and schedule events, and to send out cards and do the things, the administrative type things? It'd be good, wouldn't it? You got to pay her. She can't come here and work for free. It'd be good if we had somebody that we could pay a decent salary that take over our youth program and just do a knockout job with that and build that and maybe even go into our high schools and preach and represent Reed Springs. Boy, everybody says that's a good idea, don't you? It takes money. It takes money to add staff. It takes money to build a family life center that we've been dreaming about and talking about for years, don't it, David? It takes big money. It takes money to do that. And you see, to reach lost people, you know what? The evangelist, he pulls up to the gas tank. They don't say, oh, he's an evangelist. You just get that gas. They don't say that. They charge him the same thing you pay to go to a ball game to pay for gas. Missionaries, they pay for airfare. They have to have Bibles printed. They have to live. They have to have income. To do the things that God would like to see done, it takes money in this world. That's the economy we live in. And if you're a bottom line kind of guy, let me tell you something. Just do the math. If everybody in this church, and you just do it conservatively, you can figure up a conservative amount that somebody makes maybe per year or whatever on average in the church, and you do 10% of that and multiply it by the families we got in this church. I'm going to tell you what we'd do. We'd build whatever building we wanted. We'd put the staff on we wanted, and we'd support all the missionaries we wanted. People would be getting saved, and we'd see it in our church. If people would just only give that 10% that belongs to God anyway. And so when you, church member, are thinking, boy, I'd like to see this happen at Reed Springs. I'd like to see our youth department grow. Don't come to me and talk to me about it if you're not tithing. I don't want to hear it. You'd say, boy, I'd love to see that family life center. If you're not tithing, you keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear it. Pastor, that's harsh. That's plain. That's plain. Faith without works is dead. You might say, Pastor, well, I'd like to volunteer and take a position in this church. I'd like for you to ordain me as a deacon. Are you tithing? Then you've got no business being in leadership. It's just a fact of the matter. Preacher, I think I'm going to volunteer to teach a Sunday school class. Are you tithing? No. If you can't do what the basic requirement of a church member is, then you don't need to serve. You say, Pastor, is it that big a deal? I believe it is. I believe it is. And folks, it's not a matter of piling up money. It's a matter of doing the work of the kingdom that needs to be done. And so on a practical level, let me challenge you. There's much to be done. Give. It'll be given back to you. As they come get a song this morning, I know I preached a challenging message.